Impact Dialogues, a podcast by the ERC-funded research project Populism and Conspiracy Theory.
Welcome to another episode of Impact Dialogues, a podcast produced by the ERC project on populism and conspiracy theory. My name is Michael Butter and I'm a professor of American Studies at the University of Tübingen, and I'm the PI of this project. In this particular series of episodes, I talk to the researchers with whom I collaborated in the project over the past couple of years, and they share the insights from the research that they have conducted for the project. I'm very happy that my guest today is Constanze Jeitler, who was a PhD researcher in the project for a couple of years and who is now an assistant professor of history at the University of Munich. Welcome, Constanze.
Thank you so much for inviting me to the podcast.
So, what did you study in your research for the PACT project?
I studied the history of the far-right Austrian Freedom Party, but maybe I can take a step further back, because for me, it was always clear that if I do a PhD, I would preferably do it on the Austrian far-right after 1945. As a historian, I was always interested in National Socialism and the Holocaust, its aftermath, and post-war European history. And it somewhat struck me as odd that there was no book specifically on the history of the FPÖ since the 1960s and 1970s. And of course, there are studies from far-right historians, in slight quotation marks, and those who think of themselves as such. But with the notable exception of Margit Reiter's study on the founding of the VDU, so that's the predecessor party of the FPÖ, and the early FPÖ, no historical study exists. And this is particularly odd because the FPÖ is the most studied and analyzed party in Austria and one of the most studied and analyzed far-right parties in Europe and probably the world. But we know very little about the party's history before the 1980s, before it became a quote-unquote populist party. And when I always talk to journalists, politicians, civil society activists in Austria, and they are always wondering what was the party like in the 1960s, in the 1970s. And people know in Austria that the FPÖ was founded by former, in quotation marks, National Socialists. And they know about Jörg Haider, they know about Heinz-Christian Strache and like all the subsequent FPÖ leaders. But in Austria, little is known about the history of the party per se, and little is known about the internal history and memory culture of this party. And this is what I'm trying to do in my study.
So, in very broad strokes, what would you say, how has the party developed from its founding up to its populist turn?
The FPÖ was founded in 1956 by a group of former, in quotation marks, National Socialists, high-ranking National Socialists. And the FPÖ emerged from another party, from the VDU, which was a rallying pool for these former, always in quotation marks, National Socialists. And I always put former in quotation marks, and it's hard to do in a voice recording. It's easier to do in writing, because those were individuals who remained fervently committed to Nazism after 1945. Why did they become politically active? It's because they experienced the end of the Second World War as a downfall, as a catastrophe, and they regarded denazification and transitional justice as a grave injustice, as a political persecution of dissidents, even as a crime against humanity on par with Nazi crimes and perhaps even genocide. So that's the foundation of the party. And what I did in my study, and this brings me perhaps to the question of how the party has developed over time. I started in the present, so when we started the project in 2020 during the pandemic, and then I worked my way back into the history of the FPÖ. So at first I was most interested in the eras of Heinz-Christian Strache and Jörg Haider as party leaders. And as a journalist once very aptly wrote, and that brings me perhaps to the populism of the party, is that Haider loved to play the role of the politician close of the people, while Strache truly embodied it. So Haider came from a very wealthy background, whereas Strache was really kind of this working class hero. But Haider, even more so than Strache, was regarded as the archetypical populist in the 1980s. So as a new kind of charismatic and provocative politician. And he won elections by firing up resentment against the elites and foreigners and employed what is also often referred to in populism studies as calculated ambivalence. So he directed racist, revisionist, and sometimes anti-Semitic statements both to his audience, to his voter base, but also to his critics, who then, of course, reacted and caused a scandal. But then I started wondering, how did Haider become FPÖ leader in the first place? So what was his basis within the party? And why was he and others in the party disgruntled with the party leadership? So I'm kind of working my way back in the history of the FPÖ. And this brought me to the so-called liberal, again, liberal in quotation marks, phase of the FPÖ. And this was a movement within the party that wanted to modernize the party to make it fit for government. Because the main problem of the FPÖ ever since its foundation in the 1950s was none of the other parties wanted to cooperate with this group of former National Socialists and far-right actors and extremists and people who were regarded as neo-Nazi radicals and what you have. So that was a huge problem for the FPÖ, because if you do politics and if you are a politician, of course you want to govern at some point and shape what the country and what society looks like. And so there was this rather small number of young people who were born after the Second World War who wanted to reform the party to make it fit for government. And they were supported by then FPÖ leader Friedrich Peter. And Friedrich Peter was a former Waffen-SS member who was probably involved in war crimes during the Second World War, who was the first person to call on these former National Socialists and other diehards to leave the past and this staunch resistance habitus behind and to reform the party and its ideology, its program, towards a greater emphasis on actually liberal ideas of democracy and society. And Friedrich Peter is somewhat of a tragic figure, if you will, in my story, because I do believe, or I think it really shows in what I have found on him so far, that he was genuinely committed to reform the FPÖ and to turn it into a party that was able to govern and cooperate with other parties. And he was genuinely interested in leaving the past behind. But at the end, he himself was denied a post in the government when the FPÖ joined in 1983 because his past had caught up with him. And so this is where my study starts, which is the debate about Friedrich Peter's past and Friedrich Peter's career in the Waffen-SS. And actually, it starts with the story about how Austria, for the last time in the 1960s and 1970s, debates on whether there should be a continued criminal prosecution of National Socialist crimes. This is also a time when the FPÖ starts to change from a group of former National Socialists and a, if you want so, lobbying organization for war criminals and SS members into a party that also has other political goals.
Okay, before we continue with this thread, I would like to ask one question about your sources, because that's, of course, always key for historians. So which material did you look at? What is your story based on?
That is a very interesting question. And of course, all historians care about our archives and sources. And especially, that is my impression, in the German-speaking context, historians are all about historical documents by governments, authorities, and parties, and documents that are official or look official with seals and signatures, if you will. And sometimes I feel the more dust documents have collected with their signatures and seals, the better. There is a problem in my research, or there was a problem, or maybe it's not a problem. The problem was that the FPÖ does not have a party archive, or at least they claim that they do not have a party archive. There have been rumors about a party archive, and it's sometimes referred to in these historical accounts on the party's history by far-right historians. My theory, however, is that they only cite the party archive to lend their account more credibility and legitimacy. And during my research, I had a rather long conversation with a woman who works for the Party Academy of the FPÖ. Party academies are similar to the German party foundations, so like the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung or the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung. So they are in charge of political education, but also research. They are the think tanks of the party. So I talked to this woman from the Party Academy, and she told me that there was no party archive and that she was in charge of building an archive. So I was in her office, and it was full of boxes that people had just dropped there with documents in a completely random order. And she also argued that if there had been a party archive initially, that it had been lost over the decade because the party moved offices several times. And I find this claim rather credible because in 2018, the FPÖ had a so-called Historians Commission, or a board of historians that was tasked with researching the party's past and coming to terms with the brown or dark past of the party. And even this internal commission, which was comprised of many FPÖ members, did not have access to a party archive whatsoever. However, there are individuals within the party or who have left the FPÖ later who collected documents during the time as functionaries and members of parliament. And I am immensely grateful for providing me access to their private collections. In addition, all of the protocols or all of the minutes from the Austrian parliament can be found online. So that was a huge resource for me. I also worked with the party newspaper, which can be found in various libraries all over Austria. And also circling back to these individuals who granted me access to their private collections, I also conducted interviews with former FPÖ politicians, but also researchers who conducted research on the party. And these interviews provided a unique glimpse into the party and more broadly the far right as a community and as a social space where personal relations often mattered more than ideology. A major part of my sources come from institutions that did observe or surveil, if you will, the FPÖ. And that was one of the first things I realized during my research, that the history of a party as controversial as the FPÖ is also a history of those who criticized the party and who contested its ideology and goals. So, for instance, I worked with documents from the archives of the Social Democratic Party in Austria, but also there is this huge archive, the documentation archive of the Austrian Resistance, that was founded by anti-fascists as a documentation of National Socialism in Austria, but very early on became attacked by the FPÖ and other far-right actors, so they started collecting documents on them. So I guess this is my wide array of sources that I'm using in my research.
I would like to come back to this moment at which younger party members are trying to modernize the party. I mean, if this happened today, turning a party into a populist one would make a lot of sense, because there's lots of role models all over the Western world and beyond that, indicating how successful populist rhetorics and styles can be. But of course, when the FPÖ turns populist, the situation is still very different. So how can we explain that it took a populist turn and not any other kind of turn?
So I think that in some regard, the FPÖ has always been populist. So it always employed, or it always had this key internal logic of a morally pure German people vis-a-vis a corrupt and morally inferior elite, which was the Austrian government, which they regarded as illegitimate because the government said we're Austrians, but the FPÖ and the far right believed that they were Germans. And this is something the FPÖ has exhibited already in certain moments in the 1960s. For instance, in the debate about the continuation of transitional justice. Transitional justice refers to legal but also political mechanisms in which a society addresses past human rights violations and abuses, and to ensure accountability for crimes in the past. The first major instance of transitional justice in the 20th century was when National Socialists were brought to justice for their crimes. Of course, this was not all National Socialists and not all war criminals were brought to justice, but only a very small number, because also the interest of the Austrian and the German government quickly waned to do that process. And the problem for the far right with transitional justice is that they regard it as an injustice because it punished crimes that were not punishable at the time when they were committed. So the murder of Jews was not a punishable offense in Germany at the time. So this is why they argue it's an unfair process. And this is why they rejected it. So how can we explain the party's populist turn in the 1980s? So first of all, this is the time when the term populism actually occurs for the first time in Austria to describe what is going on with Jörg Haider and with the FPÖ. Haider was this very charismatic, very provocative politician, but how did he come to power in the FPÖ at such a young age? He was only, I think, 35 or 36 when he became FPÖ leader. At the time, in the mid-1980s, there were various crises shaking Austria, and this led to a sort of questioning of post-war national identity. So first of all, Austria prided itself to be a socially and economically stable country after the Second World War. And from the early 1980s on, there was an economic crisis, particularly in the state industry, and it kind of became clear that the government and the state industry could no longer guarantee jobs for everyone. The second crisis was, of course, the election of Kurt Waldheim as the federal president. So Kurt Waldheim, as it turned out, was also in the SS during the war, and he had always omitted this part of his biography. And it was revealed by the World Jewish Congress and the New York Times and an Austrian magazine that, in fact, he had been in the SS and probably had witnessed crimes against humanity or was involved in them. Nevertheless, Austrians elected Waldheim as their president. So that was the second aspect of the crisis. And the third aspect of the crisis was that by the end of, or by the mid-1980s, it was clear that the Cold War was going to end. And that meant that Austria, which was a neutral country and prided itself in being sort of a neutral meeting ground between East and West, was also kind of losing its importance on the international stage. So people started asking, what is Austrian and who is Austrian? And of course, this opened a space for nationalist ideology to rise in the political discourse. Another factor is related to the FPÖ internally. So in 1983, the FPÖ joined a government alongside the Social Democrats. And it was mostly these liberal politicians who got government posts and who got jobs in the cabinets. And this enraged the old diehards and new extremists. And there was also a lot of conflict brewing within the party, which then was instrumentalized by Jörg Haider to create a base for him to rise to party leadership.
Would you say that since the 1980s, the party's populism has developed, or would you rather focus on the continuities and not so much the variations?
I think populism is kind of always the same. It's this strategy or internal logic where you pit the pure people against a corrupt elite. And I think that this logic can be filled with various contents over time and with various ideological and historical tropes. And I think that this is always that the content of populism or the content of the populist strategy is always changing. So when at the beginning of Haider's tenure as party leader, he was all about historical revisionism and referring to war veterans and SS veterans as decent people, if you will. And he also called the Austrian nation as something created in a retort and whatnot. But that is, and he always employed this as a form of knowledge that was known by the people, but was denied by the elites. So that was what he first did. And then after the end of the Cold War, it became about migration and foreigners, and the resentments grew to be more racist. And then by the mid-1990s, another trope was added, which was when Austria joined the European Union. The EU became sort of part of the sinister and corrupt elites. So this is how it evolved over time. And of course, it has also changed in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. And it also changed, of course, when the FPÖ joined the governments with the conservatives in the early 2000s and then again in 2017.
In your study, you describe the party as an epistemic community. What does that mean?
Already before I came across the concept of epistemic community, which I will explain in a second, I wanted to highlight the importance of the entanglements between ideology or the knowledge of the party, if you will, and the importance of community within the Austrian far right. And it is, after all, the FPÖ itself describing itself as a so-called Gesinnungsgemeinschaft in German, and Gesinnung means ideology or thought, and Gemeinschaft means, of course, community. And also historians and other researchers working on the FPÖ and the far right have described the party as a community of destiny and memory and ideology. So this is what Margit Reiter did in her book. And the concept of epistemic community denotes a group of people that constructs and shares common beliefs, sensibilities, and an understanding of reality. So they have a common understanding of what constitutes valid knowledge. This pertains, for instance, within the FPÖ to the knowledge that all Austrians are Germans and that all Germans were not victims of Hitler, or that all Austrians were not victims of Hitler, but of the war against Hitler. And sociologists and anthropologists have shown that far-right parties and groups can be understood as epistemic communities as they produce and advocate for a specific set of knowledge not accepted in the mainstream, because a lot of the ideology, the knowledge, and the beliefs of the FPÖ after 1945 were, of course, discredited by National Socialism.
You also highlight the role of memory for the party's self-understanding. Can you say a little bit about that and maybe also comment on how it is related to this idea of an epistemic community?
So, of course, memories are also a form of knowledge. So they also belong to the knowledge of an epistemic community. And in the case of the FPÖ, their memories, their understanding of history is deeply intertwined with their ideological roots, narratives of identity and victimhood, and their quest to reinterpret the past. So I think I already highlighted that they did not accept that the end of the Second World War was a liberation from fascism, but regarded it as a downfall and a catastrophe because a lot of them lost their status as high-ranking members of the Nazi Party. They lost their jobs, their salaries, their pensions. And in addition, as I already mentioned, from the outside, the FPÖ rejected this Austrian victim theory, and that is the theory that Austria was the first victim of Nazi aggression and that the country does not bear any responsibility for Nazi crimes. So while, of course, no FPÖ politician would admit that crimes against humanity of National Socialism were a good thing, they always tended to downplay them or even deny the Holocaust. But on the other hand, they regarded the Anschluss, so the annexation of Austria by Nazi Germany in 1938, as a liberation or as a reunification of the German people. So they rejected this whole post-war memory consensus in Austria, if you will, and rather they became enmeshed in the memory culture of veterans of the Waffen-SS, of Germans expelled from Central and Eastern Europe. And these organizations regarded SS and Wehrmacht soldiers as decent men, as loyal to their convictions, as masculine heroes. And they regarded the Germans expelled from Central and Eastern Europe and by proxy all Germans as victims of the war.
Now, the project in which we have been collaborating focuses on the relationship between populism and conspiracy theory. We've talked a lot about populism so far. We haven't mentioned conspiracy theories yet. So what role did and do conspiracy theories play for the party?
The defining character of the FPÖ and the Austrian far right after 1945 is völkisch nationalism, and a defining characteristic of völkisch nationalism are conspiracy theories. What is völkisch nationalism? It is a form of ultra-nationalism that assumes that the German people is a closed, homogeneous, ethnic, biological, and culturally distinct unit, and it assumes a hierarchy of populations and people, whereas the German people, of course, is on the top of the hierarchy and demands the subordination of specific interest under the primacy of the Volksgemeinschaft, so of the German people. And as I already mentioned, a defining element of völkisch nationalism are conspiracy theories, as they serve the construction of internal and external enemies of the state and the people. So there's a lot of scapegoating for setbacks in the realization of the pure people and enemies. And these enemy construction and scapegoating had an identity and consensus building function for the FPÖ and the Austrian far right after 1945. Because, of course, they were always in resistance to the political consensus. So, for instance, in the discourses on denazification and transitional justice, the FPÖ always criticized that transitional justice was not something the people wanted or the people had installed, but that it was installed and executed by the Allies, which is, of course, true if we talk about the Nuremberg trials. But in Austria, very early on, prosecution of National Socialists was put into the hand of Austrian authorities. Also, in the context of denazification and transitional justice, anti-communism plays a role. So, of course, the Soviets and Eastern European Slavic people are always the enemies who try to prosecute Germans for their crimes, which in the eyes of the FPÖ, they did not commit. And the FPÖ also tried to delegitimize the Austrian consensus politics after 1945. So they were always talking about that the conservatives and the social democrats, under the guidance of the Allies, were conspiring against the FPÖ as the true representative of the Austrian people. Within the FPÖ and the Austrian far right, and this is of course owed to their völkisch nationalism, are ideas of the so-called Great Replacement. The Austrian far right has always been characterized by a fear that the German people in Austria and other parts of Europe were about to be replaced by other people, other humans. So first, there was this fear of Germans in Austria and Germany being replaced by Slavic people. Then later in the 1960s and 70s, there was the fear that Austrians were going to be replaced by the so-called guest workers when labor migration became a political issue. And more recently, of course, in the context of Islamophobia, there is this fear that Austrians are going to be replaced by Muslims. I would also like to highlight that in this context of the conspiracy theory of the Great Replacement, FPÖ politicians have repeatedly used Nazi jargon. For instance, the term Umvolkung, which means replacement of the people, most recently, for instance, in April of 2025.
One of the insights of our project is that conspiracy theories are sometimes articulated openly in the countries that we have studied, and sometimes they can only be articulated in a very veiled fashion. And this very much depends on the status that conspiracism as a form of knowledge enjoys in a specific national or political culture. So, for example, we found that in Poland and in Hungary, conspiracy theories are mostly a form of orthodox knowledge and therefore can be articulated quite openly, whereas in Italy or Germany, for example, they are rather a form of heterodox knowledge and therefore are articulated not at all or in a rather veiled fashion. How is it in Austria?
In Austria, I would argue that conspiracy theories, which are in Central Europe more often than not related to anti-Semitism, could not be expressed openly after 1945. However, you have documentation that behind closed doors, anti-Semitism and anti-Semitic resentment and conspiracy theories was still expressed by the elites. And I'm saying here the elites because this is where we have documents and archival sources about conspiracy theories. And I think this is also something that we know come to the fore in Austria in times of crises and in terms of epistemic crises, so crisis of knowledge. And I think the prime example is the Waldheim affair, where there was a huge rise in conspiracy theories and also anti-Semitic resentment in public discourse in Austria. I would also, and I don't want to protect the FPÖ, nothing is farther to me, but that there are instances of the proliferation or of a high proliferation of conspiracy theories in Austria in the past with which the FPÖ had nothing to do at the outside. So, for instance, in the case of the Waldheim affair, it was the conservatives who expressed conspiracist sentiments, while the FPÖ was just leaning back and they were like, we have nothing to do with that. We're the reasonable ones, so to say. So I think that the status of conspiracy theories was shifting or was always shifting, maybe oscillating between stigmatized and non-stigmatized. But in general, I would say that in the mainstream, it was not accepted knowledge for the most part of the country's history.
Thank you so much, Constanze, for joining us today and for sharing the insights and results of your research. Your book will soon be out with Routledge, and as all of the publications of our project, it will be published in open access, so we will put a link directly under this interview. Thank you, and all the best to you for the future.
Thank you so much for having me.
Impact Dialogues. This podcast is part of the project Populism and Conspiracy Theory, funded by the European Research Council. Host, Professor Michael Butter. Production, Julius Haferkorn with C4 Studio.